IVM.
Welcome to All Things Policy, a daily podcast by the Takshashila Institution. We are a bunch of policy nerds based in Bengaluru, and we like bringing fresh perspectives to Indian affairs and Indian perspectives to global affairs. So grab a cup of coffee, sit back, and join us for today's chat.
Hello and welcome to another episode of All Things Policy. It seems that Google is in the news again for antitrust. This is just one step away from becoming one of those memes where you ask people to name a more iconic duo than Google and antitrust. To talk about the recent developments in this space, I have with me Rohan and Prateek, two people who are looking into various aspects of competition law about data and privacy and Google and Facebook and whatnot. So today is going to be a whirlwind of looking at the various developments in the recent past, how can we sparse it through, and what does it ultimately mean for public policy. So let's get started on understanding what these developments are. Prateek, can you give us an overview of the recent cases, both in Europe and in US?
Sure. And before I go into the cases, right, let me also set some background. As you said, right, we're at a point where people will think there may not be a more iconic duo unless you bring Facebook into the picture. But as expected, a lot of countries are looking very closely at this, right? So two good examples of this are the digital platforms inquiry that Australia conducted and the US Antitrust Subcommittee report, right, which we've spoken about before, right? And they looked extensively at Google and they identified potential areas for market power, which I think is useful just to set things in context, in terms of where we might see antitrust action, right? So largely, as expected, search is obviously an area, right, where the charges are around misappropriation of data and self-preferencing, right? Then there's the digital ads market or the online advertising market, which to me is one of the most interesting ones because that's where that's the one which has the most money at stake, right? And they've looked at various aspects like mergers, right? Mergers and acquisitions, how Google combines data across various business functions, as well as leveraging and imposition of various type of standards, right? And then you have a whole bunch of other things like the Android or the Google Play Store, specifically around Chrome, Maps, news media as well, and the bargaining power that they have in Australia passed legislation around that as well, right? So there's a whole host of areas where we can expect action, and like I said, the online ad space is probably the most interesting one, right? And there are three developments to talk about that happened, at some points during May, which are worth exploring. So one of them is the Wall Street Journal recently reported that in France, Google is close to settling a case brought to it by the France Competition Authority, right? And this was again, it was a self-preferencing charge brought against it by three complainants. One was News Corp, which remains the primary complainant. Then there was a French paper called, and I probably mispronounced the name, but Le Figaro, which has now withdrawn from this case because it was part of the deal that Google News signed with French publishers a couple of months ago. And the third was a Belgian media company called Group Rossel. Again, I'm probably mispronouncing the name, who've confirmed that they were initially complainants, but they've not really confirmed whether they're still part of the case, right? And like I said, the charge here was that Google is using its AdX tool and DoubleClick for publishers platform, and we'll get into what these specifically are a little bit later on. But the basic charge is that they're self-preferencing.
Yeah, so that's not entirely new, right? This is something that I expect that will come about, has come about earlier, and will probably keep coming up again and again in other cases as well. So, yeah, take us to the second case.
Yeah, and so just to add, right, I think broadly we'll see three things, right? We'll see accusations of them being gatekeepers, some form of leveraging self-preference, and exploiting information, right? Those are largely the three areas that we'll see most of them in. Right. The other case was the US one. Now, this was interesting because this was a case brought by a law firm in the US, and the case was thrown out. Right, and it's interesting because So the charges were again similar, right? That Google was leveraging its search dominance and search advertising dominance to control and its and its control over user data, and it was basically over time, you know, if it was degrading the search product and the search experience over time, right? And the reason this case was thrown out, and the judge has given them the option to rework or to amend the complaint, but they basically said it was thrown out because the judge did not agree with their definition of the relevant market, which they seem to limit just to search advertising, and they excluded your social media display advertising on the basis that search advertising is intent based, social media advertising is more awareness based. So they've basically used that to say it's a different it qualified as a different market, and they said direct negotiations are antiquated, not scalable, and not preferred by anyone in the market, so not really an option, right? And they also essentially implied that Google has a duty to support rivals in the marketplace, which the judge seemed to disagree with. And the third case is an investigation that's happening in Germany. This is less to do directly with ads. It seems to be more around how Google is gathering data across search, YouTube, Maps, and Android, right? And this is this one is still early days. We'll see how this plays out. But the other two seem to play in the the online ad space, right? Which is like I said, at least to me, seems to be the most interesting one.
Fascinating. Thanks for that. Now, let's actually get slightly deeper into this online ad space. And as we were discussing just before recording the podcast, it seems to be one of those spaces where very few people understand what's going on. And when we're talking about Google's dominance, it's easy to just say Google is dominant or they are flouting various forms of competition policy, etc. But again, it's confusing as to how exactly they're doing it. So in order to explain this further, I'll call in Rohan, who has also written newsletters on this and who's at least multiple times on this particular aspect. So Rohan, let me just give you a very brief understanding of what I have, and then you correct me when I'm wrong and or take it further, right? My basic understanding is that Google dominates all three aspects of this ad exchange or ads, right? One, they basically get money from the buying side, then two from the seller side, and then finally on the exchange side. So this is probably how it works, right? Which is that when, let's say, a user visits a website or uses an app and they see an ad, there's a high probability that, let's say, the advertiser has used Google to purchase that ad placement, and the website or the app, whatever, the website or the app publisher themselves have used Google to provide that ad space. And of course, both of that transaction has taken place on Google's own ad exchange. So basically, they're making money on all three sides. Is that good for a starting point? And how would you take that forward?
I think that's a very good starting point. I also hope that this was maybe the ending point of things, but I don't think it's as simple as they just make money on all three sides. I think a more succinct explanation is that Google owns all three sides. So in a truly Takshashila or actually using your analogy, Anupam, Google owns all these stages of the process. Google is batsman, bowler, and umpire all at the same time, right? So
right.
Let me sort of give you a little bit of a case study on how this works. Right? So because advertising is a pretty complex ecosystem, but let's say an advertiser, for example, Ford, wants to advertise on a news website like The Print, right? So Google connects Ford and The Print through this place called the Ad Exchange. For large advertisers like Ford, the place is called AdX. And for small advertisers, there's a separate exchange, which also is owned by Google. Now, Ford uses an ad buying tool to connect to the exchange. Right? On the other side, the Print connects to the exchange using an ad server tool. Now, before Print's website finishes loading, a bunch of auctions take place between the ad buying tool, the ad server tool on the exchange. And when the website's finished loading, you're looking at a Ford ad. And so basically, Google has, it doesn't just make money, it owns all three stages of the process and is fairly opaque about how it operates them. Right? And that's how it's basically been harming advertisers. Now, you had a bit of an innovation in this space by this this innovation called header bidding. It threatened to sort of hurt Google's ecosystem. So Google worked with Facebook to kill it. I think this is an argument without a lot of nuance, but Texas has filed an antitrust suit against Google that explains this a lot better. But just as an overview, this is how this ecosystem works. And let me just supplement it by saying that this is not the only way in which Google forecloses competition. Just if you look at a broad overview of this, based on the default settings of Google's products, it includes everything that you have ever searched on Google or on Chrome, every email that you have sent or read on Gmail, everywhere and every time you've ever traveled on Google Maps, everything you've ever done on any Android app, every video you have ever watched on YouTube, every meeting you have ever attended on Google Calendar or Google Meet, anyone you know in your Google contacts. And then Google has a massive amount of third-party data, including information from sites and apps that Google services use. And then this whole ad ecosystem. And Google uses this massive information advantage strategically to harm any publisher that refuses to use its intermediaries or who refuses to allow Google to operate what it owns. So that is sort of a broad overview of how this works and what other levers Google has in its ecosystem.
So if you're a competitor, let's say in that ad exchange space, you just don't have access to all of this data. So therefore, you cannot provide that kind of value to both the buyer and the seller, the kind of value that Google does, right? That's where the ad exchange. Let's talk about it in these three different parts. So that's where the ad exchange clearly wins over its competition, correct?
Yeah, so I think the ad exchange has the maximum number of buyers, sellers, and clients in general. So it's like saying that why don't you use Bing to do your searches? But you don't use that because everyone else is using Google. It makes Google better, and eventually that makes Google better for me. So why would I go to a smaller ad exchange when Google can get the job done and help me out? So it wouldn't make a lot of sense for competition to come in because a player just owns all three sides. So why not go with a monopoly that can get the job done?
Okay, that's one way to put it. Now, finally, and then I think I'll bring in Prateek here. Where does that preferential treatment come in here? So we spoke about preferential treatment or self-preferencing being one of the big aspects of what Google does, and especially the anti-competitive aspect. So where does that come into all of this thing that the ecosystem that Rohan described?
Yeah, so I think before I go to that, it just might be helpful to introduce an analogy, right? That I've the likes of Tim Wang and Deena Srinivasan have used. They've made an analogy between the ad marketplace and financial markets to some extent, right? So if you extend that, right, your exchange that Rohan spoke about is basically like your trading venue, right? Now you can have multiple trading venues. And then you have two intermediaries, right? One on the publisher side, or in Rohan example, the print side, right, which is the ad server, and on the advertiser side, which is in this case, since we're talking about Ford, the intermediary is equivalent to your various buying tools that you have, right? So that's sort of what the space is like. And as Rohan made the case that Google does operate one of the larger ad exchanges. It does have it offers buying tools. You can only buy ads on YouTube. Sorry, an advertiser can only use buying tools by Google for YouTube. Just one example.
Right.
And publishers also have to typically tend to use your ad servers from Google. Now they have the option to use multiple things, but over the years there have been cases of different types of industry practices. Like earlier, you had to put you were incentivized to put Google first, the Google Ad Exchange first, right? And the other sort of thing that Google did was you reference data. So while Google Exchanges Google Exchange had all the information, and Google Intermediate had all the information that Rohan pointed out, what they did was that they scrambled IDs for other participants in the marketplace, right? This is whether you're another intermediary or whether you're a buyer or whether you're a publisher or an advertiser, right? So which means now print does not have all the information of its own readers, but Google does,
right?
And it's not that so Google itself is making these these, using these insights to improve their products, but others don't have this ability, right?
When you're talking about the ad buying tools, these are all the tools that are that give you insights about the various readers and basically the customers that you want to target. Is that what the buying tools are?
So that's more on your So that's so that would come on the Ford side of the analogy, right?
Right.
They are the one doing the targeting. So that's where the ad buying tools come in. And similarly on the publisher side, at that point it's about who is going to give you the most money for that ad spot, right? That if I like a reductive version of an argument is essentially who's going to give me the most money for that ad spot that's on my page, right? But so largely it comes down to a couple of things, right? So what happens is that essentially Google ends up with one information advantage because it has all this information that it's able to gather. They also make the case in some cases for speed advantages, right? And this is I'm quoting from one of the points that Dina Srinivasan mentioned in her paper. And the logic behind this is that Google tools are typically co-located or using the same, typically located together or at least geographically more proximate than a third party's tools would be. Now, this is not exactly how it plays out in the real world because of cloud infrastructure, but you can see some sense in it that Google tools will have more proximity to some of these. And the reason that's relevant is because, as Rohan talked about the ad auctions, right? How quickly you respond to an ad auction is extremely important.
Right. So come back to the self-preferencing bit now.
Yeah. So the other aspect of it was that, look, so there are various things that they do that steer you to using either advertising on Google properties, right? Which is, I gave the example of the fact that for YouTube you need to use Google tools, right? And you need to use Google exchanges. They had this concept that Google would go first, right? The Google exchange would essentially be first in that.
Right.
So yeah.
So let me try and put this all together, right? Firstly, there's a lot of data that is collected on Gmail, YouTube, the entire thing, that scary bit that Rohan was speaking about. All of this is used for and made into tools and insights which people can use, which people are almost forced to use. Then that is used on the exchange to buy ad spaces back on Gmail and YouTube and so on. That's the convoluted kind of ecosystem that we're talking about.
Yeah, I think that's broadly it, Anupam. I think the important part here really is when you said that people are forced to use. I think the important part is yes, that is how the advertising industry works. But the broader question is the industry actually working, or is it just one big player that's working and others are just forced to live with it? And I really think that these cases at least sort of are hinting to the fact that this industry is so dominated by Google that this is the only model that we have right now.
Right. So that's interesting. Now, let's try and speculate. Now, I completely understand that whatever we speak about from here on is pure speculation, and it's grounded in some form of logic, but not necessarily any kind of prediction. Rohan, I'm going to put you on the spot. What do you think will happen next with these cases? Where do you see it going forward? Let's say that there is some form of antitrust action based on these cases against Google. What do you see will happen next? Or is that even possible?
I must admit, I think this question's a bit of a Pandora's box, if only because there are a few things we need to consider when we answer this. Firstly, what jurisdiction goes after Google? Do they have the authority to make structural changes? Right? So if things are happening in France, does France have the power to say that Google AdSense, Google Ad Exchange, and Google AdWords will be completely different and won't work with each other as well as they do right now? Or do they go after, let's say, spinning YouTube off into a completely different entity? Right? So first, we have to realize not all jurisdictions are equal here. And so let's talk about, I think, the most significant one, which is if something happened in the US. I think Texas came up with a case, and they have broadly talked about they've already talked about the ad industry. Now, is this fundamentally going to change the structure of the ad industry? I don't know. But would it be a good thing if they did? Maybe. Yeah, sure. Similarly, it's not just Texas, but a bunch of other states are likely going to argue that we should spin off YouTube into a completely different entity, or Android into a completely different entity, right? So a bunch of things can happen here. I think the most likely one that might happen, I would really like it to be YouTube spinning off, not least because it's sort of, I think, the biggest market or the most relevant market, at least in my mind. YouTube has a bit of a bit of a monopoly. So I think that's the one that they should really go after, and maybe the ad market next. Android can be a third one. So I think my speculation is that we go with YouTube. Yeah,
Are you essentially again suggesting a breaking up of big tech?
that's the literal opposite of what I just said.
You said we should spin off YouTube as a separate entity?
No, I didn't say we should.
That's his prediction, right? That's his prediction.
Yeah, I think that's the one that's most likely to happen.
Or that could happen.
Likely to happen, right? Okay, but it's not that you're recommending that piece. I was shocked because I remember you and I had a big podcast about the futility of trying to break up big tech, especially Google and so on. So, okay, so that's what might happen.
Yes.
Okay, on another count, let me look at one of the other suggestions that's been put forward, right? Which is to look at, again, based on an understanding that vertical integration among these platforms is almost inevitable. That Google owns different parts of that entire chain, owns, operates, dominates, etc., different parts of that chain, and it is almost inevitable. And trying to break it up would lead to probably far more harm than it can otherwise do good. So the other suggestion, which is to say that, okay, how can we ensure platform neutrality? Again, this is something that we've spoken about earlier in different contexts. But in this particular context, one particular suggestion talks about looking at these ad exchanges as any other exchange in the financial realm. And a lot of the rules that apply in the financial exchanges, so maybe, let's say, a stock exchange, currency exchange, etc. A set of rules apply there, which will, in all probability, completely disallow all of these practices that we are seeing in the ad exchange market. Is that something which is feasible? And Prateek, you shared some recommendations on this.
Yeah, so this is interesting, right? And it sounds very simple at an abstract level, right? Which is to say, yes, there are the way the markets work is analogous to some extent. So, what we can do is ensure that there is fair access to information and speed. And then you say that, okay, look, you have to manage intermediary conflicts of interest, right? Which is you make sure there are structural separations. So you can't be using, the ad server can't be using data that the ad exchange has, that the buying tools have, things like that. And there are proper rules for.
Sorry, Prateek, if it uses, that has to be made accessible to everyone at the same time, not just Google.
Agreed, exactly. So that you don't self-preference, right? You either make it available to all, which will bring in the privacy thing, right? And then that's the third aspect of this. But let's say, so either you make sure there are separations so that you are not unfairly advantaged, or you don't have unfair advantage and access to that data when the rest of the when the other participants in the marketplace don't have, right? The other is, again, conduct and disclosure rules. And there's one more that's thrown about, which is talking about transparency in general. Right now, these sound simple at a high level. I think the implementation of these is going to be difficult, right? And that's where the challenge is, because there is the market as it operates today is so opaque. There are multiple levels of intermediary, right? Even the landscape that we gave was still fairly abstracted. There are, if you go into the technical aspects of it, there are still a whole bunch of other companies that operate and have, come in at different levels of the stack that need to be integrated, that also have access to data, and it flows. So it's not that easy to do, but I think this argument does seem to be catching on.
All right, thanks. Rohan, you want to add something?
Hey, I just want to add one little what do you call this example? I forgot the term for it. It'll come back to me. But when you said to talk about platform neutrality and how to regulate this, I was reminded of this conversation I had with a friend who recently downloaded Audible, right? And she downloaded that on her iPhone. and she comes up to me and she's like, how do I buy a book on the Audible app? And I don't think I have ever had a podcast on a call, but I think that was it. Because if I could just tell you the amount of convoluted laws and policies that go into place to make sure that you can't buy a book of the Google Play Store on the iPhone or the Audible market on the iPhone.
Well, you can't buy a book of the Google Play Store on the iPhone. It's not possible anyway.
Yeah, exactly. And like the reason that's like the platform neutrality debate that it spurs, it's just nuts. I mean, I think we should do a whole different podcast on the Apple and Epic lawsuit that happened, because I think it's really, I think what's the word, pertinent to this time and to this conversation. But I really think this whole platform neutrality conversation is just the most fascinating time to be alive. So my whole contribution to this is I'm very glad that we're having this conversation. Is the TLDR of this.
All right, thanks. I'm absolutely convinced, and so is Prateek, that all of this is an elaborate ruse or made-up example just to say that I have a friend. Rohan, we believe you.
Or I have a reading list that people should check out.
Yeah. Nonetheless, all right. So I think we'll end there with the firm understanding that this is just scratching the tip of the iceberg, to use a very old cliched metaphor, and to understand that we are not really talking about solutions here. We're barely beginning to understand the problem in the way that the ecosystem is set up. And there are multiple other conversations to be had on all of these topics. We'll keep a close lookout on the developments in this field, and we'll come back if there's anything more interesting happening. So that's it for today. Thank you so much for listening in, and do tune into our other episodes as well. Thanks.
If you liked our show, don't forget to check out other interesting podcasts on the IVM network. You can tune into them on the IVM Podcast app, ivmpodcast.com, or wherever you listen to your podcasts. You can also follow IVM on social media. The handle is @IVM Podcasts on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. And hey, if you'd like to dive into Takshashila's research on technology, strategy, and economic affairs, check us out at our Twitter handle @TakshashilaINST or our website takshashila.org.in.
I hope you enjoyed that show. If you aren't following us on social media, please do. We're IVM Podcasts on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. We'd like to thank the sponsors on the network this week, Seth and Cred. We really appreciate the support. It is what makes this possible. So it was a fun week on Cyrus Says. We had guests like Dolly Singh, we had Guneet Monga, we had Kamya Jani of Curry Tales, and Cock and Bull, as we always did. Do check it out. I think you'll really enjoy that. On Paisa Vaisa, we crossed 300 episodes, and Anupam was joined by Akhil Handa, the digital head of Bank of Baroda. All Things Policy discussed topics like the 100 years of China's Communist Party, the Facebook versus the Government of India case, and the evolution of Indian science. On the Wire Talk, Siddharth Bhatia was joined by Gautam Bhatia to discuss the Central Vista project and why it's attracting so much flack. Sadaf and Archit are back on the Non-Curry podcast, and this time they raise the temperatures as they discuss the beloved spice mirchi. On the Millennial Athlete, this week Tanvi and Shlok speak to Sarita Chauri, a visually impaired judoist. And finally, I want to ask you all to give a listen to the Triangle Offense. Anybody who has heard me talk on a podcast knows I can't shut up about basketball, and these guys know more about it than I do. So if you enjoy basketball, do check this out. Nishant and Monish do an excellent job with this show. I was one of their guests a few months ago, which is how I met them and tried to convince them to come onto the network, and they're finally here. So definitely do check this out. Show's available on all major podcasting platforms, but they also have a daily YouTube episode, which is available on the IVM Podcast channel. And with that, I hope to see you again next week.
Come learn and experience the ABCDs of being queer with me, Shunetro,
and me, Farhad,
on our show, Gay BCD.
The two of us take you through our stories and experiences of being gay men in the city of Mumbai and have candid
and sometimes downright scandalous
conversations about sexuality, gay culture, and everything in between.
Catch new episodes of Gay BCD every Tuesday on the IVM Podcast website, app, or wherever you get all your podcasts from.